Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Michael Matt down here in the Underground for the Remnant Underground. Tonight I am joined by my friend and ally, Christopher Ferrara, who joins us from Virginia because he's in town tonight to argue tomorrow night on the question of religious liberty with Eric Cardall at the Argument of the Month Club. Chris, how are you?
I'm great. I'm glad to be down here in the catacombs. I heard the footsteps of the Roman soldiers behind us. Glad we got down here in time.
We just barely got down here, but it's good that we're here. Yeah, I'm excited. So tell me, first of all, why did you agree to this debate? This is an interesting topic. Religious liberty right now is on everybody's mind. What do you think you're going to bring to that?
Well, I've written a book on the whole subject of how this whole notion of religious liberty introduced into the Western world following the Protestant revolt by thinkers like Hobbes and Locke results in a devil's bargain. And this bargain is that in exchange for being tolerated, Catholics will agree that, publicly speaking, their religion is irrelevant. They consent to have their religion consigned to the realm of the private. The phrase private voluntary society has been used to describe the arrangement. We have the public society. That's where all the important stuff goes on, government, finance, and so forth. And then the private voluntary society, where people can have their little temples and their religions of various kinds, as long as everyone agrees under this Lockean notion of the law of toleration, that nobody's religion is publicly true. It might be your private opinion, but don't expect public policy to be determined by religious truth, even if it bears on morality. Don't expect the laws or institutions of the nation to reflect revealed religion in general, and in particular, of course, Catholicism. And the whole Enlightenment project, from its very beginning, has been all about keeping the Catholics down.
Well, explain to me why it is that, I mean, how does the process work whereby we lay claim to this right of religious freedom, so-called, that's supposedly being extended to us, but I'm not quite sure that it is. It wasn't extended to the French and the Vendée. It wasn't extended to the Cristeros ultimately, even though it was offered as such. But in the process of us accepting this, as you say, devil's bargain, how is it that we lose the freedom of religion then?
Well, yeah, you have to follow the con game carefully, because it's the same game they've been playing since the time of the Protestant revolt. And it's the game in which liberalism causes a problem, and then liberalism prescribes the cure for the problem, which makes the problem worse. So you begin with the Protestant revolt. Christianity fractionates into all these different sects, and then the sects vie for political power. So you have religious wars in the 16th and 17th century, ripping apart the fabric of Europe. So the solution is something like the Peace of Westphalia. Every nation will have its own religion. The sovereign will pick the religion of the Protestant nations. And if you have a Catholic sovereign, he can say that Catholicism is the religion of the state. And from that stage, where you have these different national religions in the newly created nation state, then you move to pan-religious toleration within each of these nation states. Locke comes in about a century later, or his doctrines come in about a century later, and the idea is that all religious strife will be eliminated by abolishing the confessional state, even the Protestant versions of it, so that all religions agree to privatize themselves and thereby neutralize themselves. So the biggest deprivation of religious liberty, which nobody seems to notice, is this agreement that religion is a private affair. It doesn't have any influence on laws, public policy, public institutions, the judiciary. It's simply a private affair. Right then and there, the church loses her freedom.
Because it should be a public, religion is a public thing, or it should be.
Of course it's a public thing. Yeah. Our Lord proclaimed the gospel and gave his church a divine commission to make disciples of all nations, not just individuals. Mm-hmm. He didn't say go forth and establish religious toleration. He said proclaim the gospel to all nations. And that means the nation must be conformed to the requirements of the gospel. And that means not just individuals privately, but public institutions, laws, the judiciary, all aspects of life. Everything, in fact, in social order, privately and publicly, is ordered to man's highest good, which is the possession of God, eternal beatitude.
Now, talk to me for a moment about the traditional understanding, which I understand is probably what you're going to present at the Argument of the Month. A priest friend of mine, Father Francois Linné, who you probably know from the Society of St. Pius X, he used an analogy that to me seems like it gets right down to it pretty quickly, where he says, as a priest, he may encounter a woman who's being emotionally abused by her husband, or maybe even to some extent, not physical. She's not getting beat around, she's more or less being emotionally abused. But they have children. So the priest may say to the woman, you must stay in this abusive relationship for the sake of the family, which would be the common good. And there's a tremendous difference between saying to that woman, stay in this relationship for a greater good, the difference between that and saying that the husband has the right to abuse her. So would you say that's a fairly apt analogy of how the traditional understanding of religious freedom, if you will, operated in the Catholic confessional state? There was a toleration of, for the common good sometimes, of false religions, which is vastly different than saying those false religions have the right to propagate their error.
Well, the idea of a Catholic confessional state had to change to accommodate circumstances. There was a time when the Catholic state was simply that. There were no Protestant denominations. There was no religious division in society. But with the emergence of Protestant sects following the Lutheran Revolt, and then the Henrican Revolt by King Henry, and then Calvinism coming onto the scene, you had, before long, upwards of 10,000 different denominations. So what do you do in that situation? If you want to maintain a Catholic confessional state, once you have these other groups within society, it caricatures the Catholic position to say that, well, we go and find all the heretics and burn them, or find all the heretics and throw them in jail. No, these organizations, these religious entities formed by people for human ends, not divinely established, are given a certain place in society, as Leo says. They're allowed to have their allotted space, provided that the ethos of the Catholic state is maintained. How does that work practically? In Spain, for example, Protestants under the Concordat with the Holy See that existed before and for quite a while after Vatican, till about 1975, Protestants were allowed to have their churches. But they had to be in inconspicuous buildings.
And they weren't allowed to proselytize.
They couldn't be conspicuously church buildings, which would be attractive to people and might draw them inside. They couldn't proselytize. But no one was going to come and arrest them if they wanted to believe their various heresies or read the Protestant version of the Bible. They were given a place in society, provided they kept their religion private. Now, the privatization of religion is entirely appropriate with a false religion. The church has always said that within the family, for example, the state has no right to come in, break down the door, and baptize all the children. Because the family is a kingdom that exists prior to political society, and the father is the head of that kingdom. And unless he's violating the natural law, say having his kids handle snakes or drink poison, the state has no right to interfere in the domestic kingdom. And so that principle was extended to the toleration of Protestant sects even in Catholic countries. In the realm of the private, their religions were privatized, but Catholicism remained the religion of the state, a public as well as a private religion. Under the modern arrangement, all religions agreed to be on equal footing and to be reduced to private clubs. Cardinal George even complained about it. He said, well, we've been put into a position of being a private club, as if that were something new. That was always the arrangement in America. It's just that now the other shoe has dropped. Now we see the implications of it all.
So are we getting to the point now where our religious liberty as Catholics is safeguarded if we pretty much de facto ceased being Catholics?
Well, the religious liberty they're talking about, this devil's bargain, is the right essentially to worship in private. They subtly substitute terminology. For freedom of religion, we hear instead of freedom of worship. You can worship in your little temple off in your private enclave or your little Catholic church down the block, but don't take it into the streets. Don't expect it to be publicly true. So that's what they call religious liberty. True religious liberty is, first and foremost, the liberty of the church. The church has to be free to remake social order, as the church did for 15 centuries, with interims, of course, for the so-called Dark Ages, when after Rome fell, and before the church could be restored to her proper place in social order, before the West was reconverted. But for most of its history, the Western world has been more or less a Catholic civilization whose governments were more or less confessional in form. Doesn't mean it was a Vatican army as such. In say Germany, post-Reformation, Europe had private armies. It had its own sphere of governmental activity. But in those states that remained Catholic, there was a connection, which Leo likened to the connection between the body and the soul. You had two separate spheres connected, the one to the other, like the body inhabits the soul. And Leo said, if you can cut the connection between church and state, then the state becomes a soulless entity, morally dead, that has no conscience. And that's what we have, obviously.
What explains this phenomenon? I know you've seen it, and we've all seen it, where many of our Catholic brothers are pretty much satisfied with the way things are. They want to talk about the Inquisition. They want to talk about forced baptism. They want to talk about all these black legends that they seem to want to buy into in order to justify this Americanist model, which they believe, I think, that they fairly much are convinced that that's a superior model, that we actually have figured it out now.
Oh, sure. You know? They think we figured it out, that they have their freedom of worship. Meanwhile, 50 million babies have been aborted. Heresies have abounded throughout the Western world over the past 250 to 300 years. The family has been destroyed. Contraception is sold everywhere. Pornography is being pumped into our society like sewage into a sewer system. Everything's falling to pieces. But they say, this is a wonderful American model. Mm-hmm. It's not a wonderful model. It's an accommodation. I mean, Leo said, these modern arrangements can be tolerated as the means to an end. You could use democracy to retransform society through the democratic process into something resembling a Catholic state or a Christian state adapted to modern times. Hungary just did it in 2012. Mm-hmm. They adopted a Christian constitution in Hungary, which contains a human life amendment we can't get in this country under the so-called perfect model. It also contains a definition of marriage as between a man and a woman in the Constitution, with explicit references to the Christian roots of Hungary and St. Stephen, the king. You couldn't ask for a more Christian document, and it was adopted in 2012, so it's entirely possible.
Well, isn't that what Leo was trying to say in the run-up to Testem Benevolentiae? I can't think of the name of the encyclical, Oceana...
Linguica Oceana.
Where he's reminding his American bishops that, in fact, the Catholic Church, Rome, had worked with the North American College, with Georgetown University, trying to Catholicize America. And if that were possible, then the model that we had set up would work. But to the extent now that we see all of our Catholic institutions shrinking, indeed our churches and our parishes disappearing, our school system falling apart, that's just the opposite of what Leo envisioned as being a workable solution, a Catholicized America. So now what we have is just the opposite of that. So obviously, the loss of Catholic identity has led to the loss of religious freedom in that sense, because the only hope we ever actually had for religious freedom was to have a Catholic society, which now we're the furthest thing from.
Well, our so-called religious freedom is limited to grudging and ever-narrowing toleration. The zone in which we're tolerated is getting smaller and smaller. Why? Because we are now reduced to Catholic individuals who have our religious liberty, and we are helpless before the power of the state because the freedom of the church has been negated. There's no body standing between us and the church, which the church always was. The church was always not only the conscience of the state, but the great barrier against state power. Because the church was considered, at the very least, a co-equal power in an arrangement, to use a fancy term, it was called the diarchy. The two powers on earth, the temporal power that wields the sword and the spiritual power, which is superior to the temporal power when there are conflicts between the two in areas that involve issues of morality and justice and so forth. If the state is responsive to the church, then the church has true liberty. If the state is separated from the church becomes a club. We individuals become the members of a private club, and there's nothing to protect us from the democratic process.
Don't you get
shrinks our liberty.
Don't you get the impression now that basically what we are is we're appealing to our jailers for furloughs? I mean, that's the extent. I mean, we've completely ceded the whole idea of a Catholic confessional or even a Christian confessional.
I would put it this way. We're telling the jailers that they've made the cell too small. Before we had a 10 by 10 cell. What's this? Now it's a 6 by 8 cell.
But now we're staying in the cell.
We're staying in the cell. And the way to get, if we got out of the cell, to which we have our own key, because of the democratic process, which could be accomplished, I would think, first on the local level. If we, for example, in a town like St. Mary's in Kansas, although I don't know if that's necessarily the model, any town, said, for example, let's consecrate our town to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Let's have a Catholic mayor and a Catholic board, since 95% of the people in this town are Catholics. And Protestants, we have no problem with you. This is a Catholic town. We live by the 10 Commandments in this town. That's our town charter. There won't be no contraception sold in this town. This was Monahan, the Pizza King's idea for a town in Florida. He had all these great visions that he was going to set up Ave Maria town as a Catholic enclave. And that's what he should have done. What all it took was a threat from the ACLU to get him to abandon the idea, and soon Ave Maria town was welcoming gays. But if he had stood up to them,
And there's where we maybe have the strength. If we could reassert ourselves as a truly Catholic voice, as opposed to participants in this experiment, which has obviously gone awry, maybe we could have backed Monahan. Maybe we could have made that happen. But because we're so whimpering and weak and simpering now, he didn't get any backing, so he just caved to the media.
I can see a scenario where you set up a town, and maybe it would have to be a private gated community. Because any kind of a municipality organized under the usual municipal laws becomes a subdivision of the state. And if it's a subdivision of the state, under constitutional jurisprudence as it is now laid down for us by precedent, any subdivision of the state is subject to the Constitution of the United States, applied to it through the 14th Amendment, so that it has to be religiously neutral. It cannot establish a religion. So you set up a private gated community, which is not a subdivision of the state. And you say, this is a Catholic town, and only Catholics can live here. And I'm not sure if the ACLU could do anything about that.
Yeah, right.
It might try to argue that such an entity has acquired the characteristics of a town and should be treated as a public entity. But it might begin that way. Or it might begin with some kind of miraculous social metanoia. Maybe there'll be some kind of catastrophe, and 20 or 30 million people will wake up and start electing, if not Catholic candidates, then maybe some kind of Christian Catholic fusion candidate.
Yeah.
That's what happened in Hungary, by the way.
Sure.
The Hungarian Constitution was produced by a coalition of Protestants and Catholics.
Sure, look what happened in France. Whoever would have expected that the single largest demonstration and serious protest against gay marriage would take place in France, of all places, where I think mass attendance now is down below 5% in that formerly Catholic country. So the idea that God could work through any one of these nations to a degree is not unthinkable. It certainly is plenty precedent for it. But we have to, at some point, begin to assert ourselves. I want to shift gears here because it's related, but it's a bit of a gear shift, and it's with respect to Pope Francis, who seems to have himself bought into this whole sort of idea that Catholicism is no longer able to assert itself, that the Pope is no longer able to truly pontificate, that he doesn't even have the authority anymore. So what does he do? He makes these incessant appeals to the media, to the camera, to see the reasonableness of his argument, maybe or maybe not. And that seems to be the extent of his ruling so far, at least, the Catholic Church. And that I don't mean to pick on the Holy Father. It just shows you to what extent the enemies of our church have been victorious.
Well, there was an opening to the world at Vatican II. The windows of the church were thrown open to bring in some fresh air, as John the 23rd so famously remarked to some news reporter. And then, not long after, Paul VI was saying, well, the invasion of the church has become, the opening of the windows of the church has become an invasion of the church by worldly thinking. And then he said the smoke of Satan has entered the church because they opened the windows to the world. We've had 50 years of this. So I don't know what makes the Holy Father think further appeasement of the world is going to make the church more attractive to the world.
Yeah.
The world is not interested in becoming Catholic. And by the world, I don't mean everybody in it. I mean the powers and principalities that control the world today.
Yeah, they're not interested. And I know we've been seeing some of this right now in the press. We had this what was billed as a survey being sent out by the Vatican to sort of poll people and poll the bishops with respect to issues, cultural and moral issues affecting the family. Now, the Huffington Post, New York Times, the radical left took the very, most sort of useful or helpful elements of those questions, some of which are very poorly written, and exploited it to the wind. But if you actually go read that document, what you have there, through the whole first 3/4 of the document that the Vatican sent out, original sin is reasserted. Evolution is sort of replaced by creation. There's many references to creation, the importance of the family, one man, one woman, the importance of raising children. That's the point and purpose of procreation, of marriage to begin with. A lot of ideas, in other words, that are incredibly unpopular with the left. The left expertly overlooks the entire body of that document, which is problematic, and zeroes in on the parts that they can use. Now, I wonder if maybe we should be trying to do something like that with respect to what's happening with the pontificate of Pope Francis, not to just sort of let the left dictate, using some of the problematic and inaccurate and the way he states things to the media are easily exploited. We should probably be trying to assert the fact that the Catholic Church has not changed her teachings on faith and morals, cannot change those teachings, and in fact hasn't changed it in the last 8 months under Francis, although the whole world now thinks that it has.
Well, that's the problem, because you now have the parallel magisterium, the mediatic, to use an Italian word, the mediatic magisterium, what the media create. But then, of course, the media will create this parallel magisterium if you give it grist for the mill. And that's the problem with Pope Francis. Too many of these statements are easily manipulated, and some of them don't have to be manipulated. Mm-hmm. They're just explosively disturbing statements. So he hasn't changed any doctrines, and even the press will say that. I've read numerous articles saying, well, he hasn't changed any doctrine, but boy, what a change in attitude.
Yeah.
What a change in emphasis. And you can recite the documents of Vatican II, the documents of the Council of Trent, all the most orthodox parts of those in the most pious tones imaginable. And then if you go out and tell some atheists, you don't care if he converts, and just enough for everyone to do good,
they're going to jump on that.
You've undone the doctrinal exactitude with what the media are hailing now.
Yeah.
A change of emphasis, a change of attitude. So my advice to the Holy Father, if I were to advise him, which is never going to happen, of course, is look, one Italian commentator said, rather irreverently, but I think it's worth repeating, stop talking for 5 minutes.
Right.
And let your subordinates put out documents like the Congregation of the Doctrine for the Doctrine of the Faith put out, slamming the door, absolutely. And I'm a lawyer. I read this document.
This is just a week and a half ago.
Yeah. On any prospect of divorced and remarried Catholics receiving the sacraments, especially Holy Communion. Again, I'm a lawyer. I read that looking for the loopholes because we've seen so many documents coming out of the Vatican fill the loopholes.
Right.
This one was clearly designed to shut every loophole. I couldn't believe what I was reading. For example, it said, you are not permitted to determine in conscience that your first marriage was invalid. That will not insulate you from responsibility before God. That's for the marriage tribunal to determine. This is what Mueller said in his document.
Right.
He also said it's fallacious to make an appeal to mercy in order to adjust the situation of divorced and remarried Catholics and admit them to the sacraments, because that is a false notion of mercy. God's mercy includes his justice.
And nobody's talking about this.
Document.
Yeah. We haven't heard that in 50 years.
But not only is it remarkable that it's a document from the Vatican, which has been basically an ambiguity mill for the last 50 years or so, it's a document by Mueller, who's reputed to be, with good reason, a left-leaning bishop. You couldn't have asked for a more concretely expressed statement of the Church's teaching, leaving no room for doubt.
Well, then
at least on the face of that document, there isn't going to be a change.
There's no change. And now you've just made the point that I would really like to see more people in the Catholic press make, that we cannot let the left, we cannot allow the left to control this. We understand we have a pope who I think has made a number of blunders so far in his young pontificate. But what we're doing, if we just sort of pile on all of those things, which obviously there's plenty of exposure for what's wrong with them and what's problematic about that, if we just sort of pile on and join our voices to the left and leave out the document like you're talking about with Mueller from the CDF, we're not doing a service to the Church. We're allowing the left to control this thing. We're allowing the left now to contribute to this whole idea that the Church is poised, is right on the edge of changing her teaching on faith and morals. And we can't, again, back to the religious liberty discussion we started with, we can't let Catholics, the Catholic world, sort of labor under that misimpression or that idea that that's going to happen. It either has happened already or it's going to happen very soon. Our job now, it seems, is to elevate our polemic and to defend the Church, regardless of what Pope Francis is saying or doing, to defend the integrity of the Church.
Well, I agree. I mean, the Church is ultimately protected from promulgating error in any official way by the influence of the Holy Ghost, which is why the Catholic Church alone has held the line on all of these moral issues, including contraception. Only the Catholic Church, not even the Orthodox, have held the line on that. Of course, the Orthodox permit divorce and remarriage up to 2 or 3 times. And by the way, the CDF document notes that with disapproval, and says the practice of the Orthodox is contrary to the will of God. Although Francis had intimated that the example of the Orthodox is something that might be looked at in making a pastoral adjustment of the situation of divorced and remarried Catholics. So we have this Janus-faced situation where one side of the face is saying one thing and the other side is saying the other thing, and they seem to be opposed to each other. But the only side that matters is the one that promulgates the official teaching of the Church. So we have to be on our guard against these statements the Pope is making, and we have to comment on them when necessary. But I agree with you that we have to stress the point that thanks to the influence of the Holy Ghost, not even Francis on his worst day would promulgate and bind the church to an error of faith and morals.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. On that end, Chris, we're running out of time here, but I think you've got a new book out that maybe say something about how people can get your new book. What's the name of the book?
It's Liberty, the God That Failed, and it's available on Amazon.com, and it traces the development of the situation in which we find ourselves today. What the book calls the trajectory from Locke, meaning John Locke, to Obama. You can trace in a straight line, and this book helps you to do it. How we began with this problem, and how that problem has placed us in the situation today. We're down here in the catacombs.
Good. All right. Well, our viewers, I'm sure, will be able to find that. You can go to remnantnewspaper.com as well to find out how to order that book. It's a very important book, and contributes to the debate that you're going to have tomorrow night. Good luck tomorrow night on the debate, by the way. Yeah, hope all goes well.
Looking forward to the conviviality afterwards.
Yeah, and thanks for coming down here to the catacombs. I hope we have you come back again sometime.
Thanks.
All right, good night. Thanks very much, folks, for watching, and catch us next week for another episode of The Remnant Underground. I'm Michael Matt for Remnant TV. Thanks very much. God bless. We'll see you next time.